What is up, freaks? It's your boy Marty Bent here to introduce this episode of Tales from the Crypt. I sat down with Mr. Cool B, Ben Prentice, and Colin from the Bitcoin Echo Chambers podcast to talk about the website they created, WTF happened in 1971.com. What the fuck happened in 1971? We talk about the trends that have been happening in America, particularly around productivity, wages, and the gap and inequality that has been growing significantly since something happened in 1971. We talk about Bitcoin as a revolutionary act and very much in line with what the founding fathers of the United States had in mind when they wrote the Declaration of Independence and constructed our Constitution. I think you guys are really going to like this one. One note, I think I misrepresented Jeff Booth's stance on UBI in this after having spoke with him yesterday. So please disregard me misstating his. Don't disregard it. Just know that I think I may have misstated his stance on UBI, and you'll learn more about that early next week when I post that episode. This episode of Tales from the Crypt was brought to you by our good friends at the Cash App. You freaks already know all about them. They're helping you stack sats. They're helping you send sats, receive sats, sell sats if you so please. They're helping you buy stack sats, on a particular cadence too. They have DCA function now. I finally got it in my app. You can decide to buy a certain amount, and then if you want to do that on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, you can set that up within the Cash App. On top of that, they're helping you stack slivers as stonks if you want to. You don't have to, but you can via Cash App investing. If your favorite stonk, if you're investing in stonks, is a little too expensive, you can buy as little as $1 using the Cash App. On top of that, they have their Boost program, and it helps you save money at partner merchants. You get your little personalized debit card, you put your signature on it, a little Bitcoin sign on it, a little lightning bolt, whatever you want. Then you enable the Boost with the partner merchant. You go there, you save a little money. You can stack some sats with that. And since this is all connected to your bank account, there's no 4 to 5 day waiting periods at stack sats or stonks. Cash App Investing is a subsidiary of Square and member SIPC. As always, use the code Stacking Sats. That's STACKINGSATS. When you download the app, you're going to get $10, and $10 is going to go to our good friends at Owls Lacrosse. That's Owls Lacrosse. Enjoy this episode. I know I certainly did.
You've had a dynamic where money's become freer than free.
If you talk about a Fed just gone nuts, all the central banks going nuts.
So it's all acting like safe haven.
I believe that in a world where central bankers are tripping over themselves to devalue their currency, Bitcoin wins. In the world of fiat currencies, Bitcoin is the victor.
I mean, that's part of the bull case for Bitcoin.
If you're not paying attention, you probably should be.
What is up, freaks? Welcome back to Tales from the Crypt. It's your boy Marty Bent here for the second recording of this Wednesday. Second of three. It's 3 recordings today, boys. It's a busy day here at TFTC, but a very exciting day, hitting on 3 different topics, and this topic is something that I am infinitely fascinated by. It's something, infinitely fascinated is my phrase of the day, by the way. It is really what drove me to Bitcoin. It's a strong economics topic, which is what I am most interested in when it comes to Bitcoin and why I think it's important. We're going to dive into the What the Fuck Happened in 1971 site. WTF happened in 1971. And I'm sitting down with the co-founders of the site, Ben Prentice and Colin, a.k.a. Heavily Armed Clown from the Bitcoin Echo Chamber podcast. What's up, boys?
What's up? What's up, freaks?
Glad to be here.
Glad to finally get this in the books. I mean, Ben and I met in person probably around this time last year in New York City, and Heavily Armed Clown. I'm just going to call you Colin.
Sure.
It's easier.
Yeah, it's easier.
Colin, I was on your podcast, 2 years ago?
You were actually one of my first guests, actually. I was like some rando, and I just hit you up, and you were like, yeah, sure, I'll come on.
Yeah. I remember your dog on the Chew Toy in the background.
Yeah.
It was something you were worried about.
Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah. No, but I mean, this is a site I've been talking about and sharing a lot on this podcast, in the newsletter, and just in general conversations. I just tell people, go to www.wtf happened in 1971 to sort of get an idea of why I'm into Bitcoin and why I think it's important. So I'm not going to describe the site. You guys are the ones who built it. So let's get into why you build it and what's going on the site.
Yeah, just very briefly, I was just doing research on Bitcoin and trying to understand, why Bitcoin would be better money. And we all probably, the freaks out there know that the ending of the quasi gold standard we had from 1944 to 1971 was executed by Richard effing Nixon. I like to say, I'm not a crook. Richard Nixon just one day came out and said, I'm just going to end the convertibility temporarily. Of course, that was, over 50 years ago, and he hasn't ended it. But in your research, you probably find yourself on Wikipedia pages for Bretton Woods and Nixon shock, and you'll see some of these same charts. And that's actually how I got onto this data. And I started just kind of collecting them, being like, oh, that's pretty weird that all these charts just start going absolutely crazy in 1971. And I collected enough of them that, Colin and I were just joking one day. We were like, well, what happened in 1971, dude? What the WTF? And he was like, dude, we should throw this up on a website. And we did. And that's the story. It's just that we just found this data, and it's like, I think it's pretty alarming.
I think we started for like our own selfish purposes too, because we were both kind of like, man, wouldn't it be great if there was just one place where you could go and like look at all of this data, because it's all over the place. Like there wasn't really anywhere that Ben and I were aware of where you could find a collection of data that just showed the anomalies that happened after 1971. And so I was kind of just like, well, let's just like, we should like compile a list, like get all this in one place. And the meme kind of just evolved out of that. And I don't think Ben and I expected, that website already has like 100,000 views. I don't think Ben and I expected that many people to be interested in it, to be quite honest. But I think the meme really lands with people. I mean, you see it getting shared all over the internet in places you would never expect people to be talking about the breakdown of the gold standard.
Where's the weirdest place you guys have seen it popped up?
Like are Bernie Sanders for president on Reddit, or like a lot of like leftist forums on the internet. For some, like I didn't know this, but like they're critical of the monetary system too. They would rather, and I don't know if that's like a cognitive dissonance thing, like if they don't really understand that it really just makes socialism more impractical. But we've gotten a lot of hits from like far leftist, like socialist / communist communities.
Yeah, that's one thing that's always perplexed me, or not perplexed me, always pissed me off, is that you have like polarized people in politics, left versus right, and blue team versus red team, and they fight over these policies that really just strike at the branches of the problem, where the money is the root of the problem. And I don't think politics would be as polarized if people were focused on the root of the problem, which is we fucked up the money.
Right.
And we fucked it up really bad in 1971, particularly.
I absolutely agree. One of the things I often talk about when talking about Bitcoin is that we run around trying to put out all these fires, through politics. And, if you look at this data on this website, you see all these are the fires, right? And that we're like, oh, well, wages aren't rising with GDP, so let's increase the minimum wage. Or, income inequality is bad, so let's tax the rich and give it to the poor. But those are the fires, right? Those aren't what started the fire. What started the fire is the broken monetary system. And it seems like so much of our politics is running around chasing, putting Band-Aids on things, when it's clear that this bipartisan issue that everybody who cares to do the research can see that the money is broken, and yet nobody's talking about fixing the money except our, the freaks and the rest of the Bitcoin community. It's just mind-blowing to me. You can even see Ray Dalio, talk about that, the system is broken, and that there's a paradigm shift coming, and yet, somebody like him, it seems like it would be so obvious that he would comment on these things, but I don't know why it escapes that mainstream narrative it's just so easily. It's just hidden.
Another interesting thing too is like we've kind of cherry picked the data on the website. Like obviously we're putting stuff on there that is intentionally dramatic around the time period that we're memeing, right? Because that's the point. We want people to look at the website with no prior knowledge or understandings of finance or economics and see the data and just say, what the fuck? So there's tons of data that like Ben and I would love to put on there. And this is a constant crisis that we're in. Like go back and look at the annualized cost of a 4-year undergraduate degree. And if you really like dig into the data, you'll see that it has gone exponential, but it didn't really go exponential till the 80s. And there are almost always like second order effects to these types of things. And some you saw happen almost immediately after 1971. And then for some, there's like lag time. It waited for policy to catch up. It waited for lending models to catch up. And I would love to put, the annualized cost of a 4-year undergraduate degree on the site, but we don't want to hurt the meme. That's kind of what, because the meme has been like the biggest strength. And if we can get people who had no interest in these things, just simply looking at the numbers, just simply asking the question, what the fuck happened in 1971? Like that makes Ben and I's day. I mean, that's everything that we've ever wanted to do, is just get more people to care about this thing that we're obsessed with, which is, the money.
Yeah. And it's funny you bring up college tuition and how that started hyperinflating. And that's actually something I've been looking into more recently. And I would attribute that more to MMT-like qualities, where you have FAFSA like programs popping up in the 80s like you described, and when the government started giving out grants and just letting people get free loan, or not free loans, but easily accessible loans,
subsidized
for these college degrees. Yeah,
subsidized no default loans.
Yeah, that's when you start to see the really big spike in college tuition prices. And this is fascinating to me as a subject, college tuition alone, because it trickles down to like the high school area too. Like I was lucky enough to go to a private high school. And when I started, it was like $12,000. When I graduated, it was 17. So within 4 years of when I went there, it increased almost 50%. And then now it's like 24,000. So it's over 100. It's 100% of where I started 14 years ago. So you have 100% inflation there over, let's say, 15 years. And yet, like we were discussing before we hit record, none of this shows up in the CPI or anything. The things that are hyperinflating the most are not really accounted for in the metrics that attempt to track inflation. And it's just honestly like evil to a certain point, because you tell people like you need to go to school, you need to get a college education if you want to be successful, and they're really forcing people into an asset. It's not an asset class, but into schooling that is becoming increasingly more unattainable for your average American.
Yeah, especially in the modern day when we have this paradigm where anything you really need to learn, you can learn for free on the internet. And there's this accreditation chasing that our society does, when really a lot of that, I feel like, is not as relevant in this modern day,
Yeah, and more important, so I've been diving more into this, and I'd be very much interested to get your thoughts on this, because we have MMT becoming very popular in the mainstream now. Joe Weisenthal's of the world really pumping it and saying that it's the future, and I even have some Bitcoiners saying it's inevitable, it's coming, and they all argue that it'll never lead to hyperinflation. But so, like, am I right in saying that maybe college education is the first foray into MMT? It just hasn't been talked about in that way over the last few decades, where you have the government basically giving out money for free to something they deem as a necessity. And we have seen, I would argue, like close to hyperinflation in that realm. And it trickles down to the high school, and now even grade school and preschool, where you say, hey, you offer the loans to the colleges, and the institutions are like, all right, if the government is going to be giving They don't offer it to the colleges. They offer it to the students, And the universities go, if they're going to give it to the students, we can jack our prices up because we know they're going to get that money. And then you go down a layer to high school. They're like, hey, if you get your college degree, it's going to be worth this much. So preparing for that is worth this much now. And you just have a terrible cascading trickle-down effect that really increases, again, one of the things that is considered a cornerstone of American life and a necessity for most.
I would agree with everything you said there, but I try to take it a step farther and say that, will MMT lead to hyperinflation? Well, a lot of people ask the question and even made the claim that 2008 style QE was going to lead to hyperinflation, and we all found that wasn't the case. But inflation as defined by the CPI never really increased at all in 2008. And I think this is a really important concept to understand, because especially if you're looking at the site and you see, the massive CPI rise that happened after 1971, we saw a lot of consumer price inflation. But obviously, as you mentioned many times on the show before, that the way that you define the CPI basket has a lot of outcome on what that number looks like. And they've redefined that, I think once in 1980s and then once again in the 1990s. But regardless of that manipulation of the CPI metric, I think the worst atrocities that have been thrust upon our society from this break in the monetary paradigm that happened in 1971 has come through the use of stocks and bonds as money and real estate as money by the wealthiest class. Because, see, as Saifedean will talk about, you can't insulate yourself from the consequences of others holding money that's harder than yours. And the money that's held by the wealthy is not US dollars, it's stocks and real estate and bonds. And since 2008, massive amounts of money have been dumped on this. And we're seeing that again now today. We all got our $1,200 checks. But, anybody that did the math out and realized how much money was printed, which, by the way, you're talking about increasing 15% or 50% for your college in, a few year time. We just increased the monetary supply, the M1 monetary supply, 50% inside of like a month. And a lot of that money is still going to get dumped on the stock market. I mean, look, we're in the worst economic crisis that maybe this world has ever seen, and the stock market is up. It's absolute madness. And who is that benefiting? It's clearly the people that hold those stocks. And that's largely a huge portion of that is just this 0.1% or whatever that they hold, 70%. I don't remember the actual numbers, but just inordinate amounts of that stock market, even if some of it's held by middle classers and such, is just inflating their bags and they're coming out on top. It's just sad.
Yeah, Colin, you had the stats from today. We got some numbers released. What were they?
Yeah, the GDP contracted the most today since 2008, but stocks just hit a 7-week high.
Madness. Monetary madness.
It really is, though. And that's the weirdest thing to see in the mainstream is like the Kramers of the world, the CNBCs, Bloombergs of the world just acting like this is all normal and, hey, this is going to help produce a V-shaped recovery. It makes me feel like I'm crazy sometimes. Like, am I missing something? Well, what the fuck is this does not compute. There's an obvious disconnection between reality and what's going on in the markets.
Well, like to touch back on the student loan thing, there's, I think it's 1.5 trillion plus outstanding dollars in U.S. student loan debt. We get so abstract in the way we think about these things, but all that is capital allocation, right? And capital allocation is prone to malinvestment, and that's pretty much the name of the game in the United States financial system is malinvestment. But as these busts come, the more we rely on QE and the more we rely on inflation, and now even airdropping shitcoins into people's bank accounts, the more we postpone that liquidation of malinvestment. And it's no wonder, that things are continually getting more and more confusing, like just outright make no economic sense. Like GDP goes down, stocks go up. Explain that. You can't. It's silly. But if the longer you postpone malinvestment is not being punished, right? So of course it's going to continue. And that's probably what the student loan bubble ultimately is just one big giant malinvestment bubble, because has that $1.5 trillion of debt returned $1.5 trillion or more, in capital returns for the society as a whole or for the individuals who attend the school? Probably not. I would assume, I haven't done any research on it, but I would assume if you looked at it as a whole, people going and getting 4-year gender studies degrees are not getting a return on that investment.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to, I think, this liquidation of malinvestment that Colin's talking about here. The paradigm we're in right now is that we saw massive deflation right at the start of this crisis, because people were taking money out of stocks and real estate and they're putting it into the most liquid good, which money is supposed to be the most liquid good, and the USD is the most liquid good, and that has deflationary pressure. But we're facing absolutely massive deflationary pressure just right now as a society, because this malinvestment is trying to liquidate itself, especially in light of this crisis, where we're starting to see the water recede and see who has the swim trunks on, and those businesses that weren't sound and to begin with should be liquidated, right? And that would cause deflation and loans. So many, you're talking about student loans, but there's absolutely just the systemic corporate debt, and you talk about the zombie economy, that should be liquidated as well. So that's also massive deflationary pressure, and you have it being met with the Fed, who their job is to ensure employment, right, and to stabilize prices. So they're printing money. They're executing their mandate, and they're printing money as a kind of combating this massive deflationary pressure. And I think that leads to these situations where we say that, these things don't seem right at all. That the data just doesn't seem rational.
It certainly doesn't seem rational. I mean, it's getting more irrational by the day, like you described, like the zombie companies and the high yield corporate debt. I mean, all the bonds, the CLOs that went from AA, triple B to junk basically in the last couple months is laughable. I mean, it reminds me of the problems that S&P and Moody's and Fitch sort of created by not accurately rating the CDOs that existed during the mortgage crisis in 2008. It seems like we're repeating the same mistakes, just in a different asset class, and that seems to be the solution to these problems. Like, all right, print a bunch of money and then like go dump it into another asset class where it hides for X amount of time, and then that pops up, boils over, and we have another crisis somewhere down the line.
Yeah, I want to comment on that really quickly. I think WTF happened in 1971 is its own rabbit hole, and one of the rabbit holes that's taken me down is the Eurodollar rabbit hole. So if I've mentioned this before, the Eurodollar University series on Macro Voices is it's like 8 or 9 different podcasts that are at least an hour and a half. It's like 20 hours of podcasts, and I've listened to the entire thing twice, and I still don't understand all of it, but I've taken a bunch of notes on it. And one of the most interesting things that I've discovered is, especially during the Basel Accords that happened in the 1990s leading up to 2008, is that the way that they've defined how banks use money, the banks are using non-USD. They're using other forms of money. Just like I was saying, the wealthy use stocks and real estate as money. Well, the real estate got packaged up into these MBSs and the super senior and all these different tranches of mortgage-backed securities. And that is the underlying money of our economy. And the reason that it is because USD is such a poor money. It's such a poor store of value that the banks and the underpinnings of our monetary system are using other things of money. And when you use other things that might have better store value characteristics, but also bad monetary characteristics that are only used because of the propping up of the US dollar, then it leads to other issues that we saw just absolutely explode in 2008. And you're saying that we're seeing hints of that kind of crumbling now, even in this crisis. And I just find that so fascinating.
And it's easy to see, looking back like 6 to 12 months ago, I don't think there were a ton of economically savvy Bitcoiners or economically savvy Austrians who were surprised by what's happened. Like coronavirus or not, you go back and look at like anybody who was in the know, like eight months ago, 12 months ago, they were tweeting about like yield curve inversions. They were looking at the bubble in the junk bond market. They were saying like, look, people are here, they're searching for yield, they're taking way too much junk debt. These corporations are lending at just ridiculous rates just because they can. They have no business doing it. And it was clearly in a bubble. And just like Ben just said, it's because people are searching out alternative forms of money, right? Because, I mean, sovereign debt particularly is just about close to as good as money for now, or has been in the past. Who knows if that will continue to be the case, if those loans will continue to stay solvent. But all it is a search for good money. It's the market trying to find a better store of value than the US dollar.
Yeah. But guys, everybody's selling their assets for dollars right now. It's the strongest currency in the world. Every foreign country is trying to get access to dollars, and that gives it strength.
That's a problem.
What are you talking about?
US.
What are you talking about, man?
That's a problem for the U.S. because then it deflates our debt. It makes our debt more heavy, right? So that's why the central banks have to try to create inflation. And when they execute this massive QE events and it doesn't create CPI inflation, it just creates real estate and stock inflation. Now they're literally they're airdropping money on the citizens, and I think that's very interesting. I think that's another paradigm shift.
Yeah, and that's one we were talking about before we hit record. This is where I think people have been talking about the Fed's monetary base expanding for some time, leading to direct hyperinflation and consumer good prices. And obviously that has not been the case due to the fact that, as we've been describing, that QE money goes straight to assets like real estate and stocks. But when you start airdropping money into people's bank accounts, you shut down the economy, and millions more people have dollars that they can go spend on goods that seem to be getting scarcer and scarcer. That is a perfect storm for a hyperinflationary environment. And I tweeted that out over the weekend. I got a lot of shit, but honestly, I think it's a very big blind spot in the policy that's being enacted in reaction to the quarantining that's going on. Is are we sure that we can absorb those dollars without any significant amount of inflation in consumer good prices?
Well, and Ben has a really good point about inflation. You know, when you print money, you have to distribute it. What's the word? Unequally. Like it has to go in a certain proportion to one party more than another. Because if you just print, more money and give everybody the same amount, nothing changes. You're in the exact same situation. Maybe for like a day, you might have a little bit more spending power, but even in the midterm, nothing changes. All that changes is your unit of account, it gets another zero. So you have to distribute money that you print disproportionately to different populations. And, maybe the argument could be made there that they're already disproportionately distributing so much money to certain populations, like with the corporate bailouts and things like that, that a little bit of airdropping on U.S. citizens is just kind of counteracting that a little bit. And maybe that's a naive way of looking at it. But I'm just trying to play devil's advocate on that a little bit, trying to maybe tease out a potential other side to it.
The other problem with this method of trying to deal with this crisis that we have is the airdropping of money on people is a form of welfare. And when you start a form of welfare, it's very difficult to stop. And there's already a lot of discussions that we can see about UBI becoming more and more of a possibility. And if UBI becomes a reality, I don't think you can ever turn it off once you turn it on, because I think it would destroy the people that had come to rely on it. And that certainly will cause inflation. All the studies that Andrew Yang did for his campaign were super localized. I think they did a study in Alaska. They're like, oh, UBI didn't cause inflation. Okay, if you print a whole bunch of money and give it to people and they go buy stuff, it causes inflation. I don't care how you slice it. And that would be bad for savers, and it would be bad for fixed incomers, and it would be bad for the people that are retiring right now. I don't think it's good for anybody. Inflation is awful. Deflation phenomenal. I brought up the tech sector. Actually, I think you brought it up, Marty, before we hit record. Deflation is phenomenal because it encourages us to save, and we can buy better products with the same money every single year. I don't know why that's so hard for Keynesians to understand. Deflation is only bad for those who have lots of debt, this is nothing new to any of us here, but
yeah, like why would anybody not want prices to go down and to be able to buy more with their money? It's always perplexed me too. But going back to a couple points here, it's been funny that we've seen with the airdropping, like there's reports of people via unemployment and the Trump bucks making more than they were when they were employed, which is an interesting thing. So then you talked about the incentive of taking that UBI away. It's very hard to do that, like especially if people are already making more not working than when they were working.
And it's easy to make the mistake of thinking about these things in a bubble or like in a vacuum, I think. And I do this all the time. Like I sit there and I think, okay, well, I mean, if they're just giving people money, it's going to cause inflation, of course, because even if your spending power remains the same, but you're getting more cash, like you're going to go out and spend disproportionately because your economic calculation is disrupted. But just thinking about that in the vacuum, yes, of course it causes inflation, but we have a huge percentage of the working population right now sitting at home, doing nothing, producing nothing, contributing nothing to the exchange of goods and services. It's not how markets work. It's not what pulled us out of wearing loincloths and foraging for roots and berries. Like it's just not the way human society flourishes to have everybody sitting at home doing nothing for an indeterminate amount of time without catastrophic economic consequence. And maybe they're delaying it a little bit now, but yeah, inflation seems absolutely inevitable. More and more people competing over fewer amounts of goods.
Yeah, all right. And again, just on paper, that makes a ton of sense to me, and that's what I think is going to happen. We'll see if that plays out. But even beyond that, like Colin, you were mentioning that, like we've been talking, like Bitcoiners and people have been paying attention, been talking about this for like almost a year when the yield curve inverted last year, and then in September when the repo market started spazzing, like we predicted that something would go terribly awry in the economy. And this is where like my little conspiracy bells start going off. Like, is this long prolonged shutdown like just like a controlled demolition of something that was inevitably going to crumble within itself?
Right, because if you wanted to do like a currency reset, if you wanted to do like a sovereign debt default, right, and you understood that would bring an entire economy to a grinding halt, that would probably force a lot of people to lose their jobs, a lot of businesses to close, a lot of people to sit at home and do nothing. Wouldn't it be better if all of those things were already going on, so that when you did the currency reset, when you did the debt default, you didn't shock the system, that system had already had time to adjust? I mean, that's pretty out there, but it's not impossible. That's not, I would give that, a non-zero probability.
And you could take your tinfoil hat off for a moment still and say, even if this thing isn't engineered, meaning the virus itself or the release of said virus, at the very least, it's certainly an amazing scapegoat. If you find yourself in this position where, oh man, I would really love to blame this, massive deflationary crisis and liquidation of all these malinvestments and really the revealing of all of the things that the Federal Reserve has been doing to quote prop up the economy as actually being a horrible thing. Well, wouldn't it be great if there was something else happening right around that time, and maybe it was just serendipitous, and you don't necessarily need the collusion between the U.S. and the Chinese to release some virus for that to be a reality. That here is this case that now, you have something to blame it on, essentially.
Yeah, you could totally just take advantage of the situation. Like, don't let a crisis go to waste type of situation.
Ugh.
And again, and like Colin said, I believe there's a non-zero chance. I'm not saying that is the case, but just if you're playing out possibilities, that is certainly a plausible one. Yeah, I'm sorry. I had to bring that up because like it is.
It's all relevant.
It's almost too good to be. It's too good to be true that things were going like so bad. It almost seems too good to be true, but who knows? I don't want to. I don't want to take us down some weird rabbit hole. So, speaking of tech deflation and that making things better for the economy overall and individuals overall, it's actually very interesting that we're talking about that today. It's a good warm up because I'm going to sit down with Jeff Booth, who the name of his book is escaping me right now, but let me pull it up real quick so I don't sound like a complete dickhead. But he brings up the point in his book that tech deflation has done wonders for society, and we're succeeding in despite of the inflationary monetary policy that we have going on in the world because of this tech deflation. The name of the book is The Price of Tomorrow. Thank you for letting me find that. But he also is an advocate for UBI. He's under the impression that the advances that we're making in the tech sector on software and automation, AI, will supplant a lot of jobs. And unlike the times of the Luddites who thought the factories are going to replace all the jobs and there would be nothing to sort of come in to take that to fill in that void, he seems to be under the impression that there's going to be a void caused by this tech deflation and advancement in software and automation.
Sure. What are the lamplighters going to do whenever they bring these electric candles and put them in all the cities? I mean, it's going to be catastrophic, right?
Or think of the buggy whip manufacturers, just awful. There was a response, or there was a Peter McCormick thread where he put out a question about, what would we do under a Bitcoin standard, if the coronavirus came along and we needed to print a bunch of money to give to people to keep them alive or whatever. And I had a long response to his thread, something along the lines of, it's such a shame that this is happening in peak fiat times because, Americans have no savings, which Marty you mentioned that on literally every episode. It's like, the whatever percent of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency. There's absolutely no savings in the economy. There's such malinvestment everywhere. If this AI revolution happens overnight, it will be very frustrating that we're in this kind of fiat society and we're not prepared for any kind of black swans or anything. I'd argue in a sound money economy that we'd be much better prepared to deal with such things. Obviously, automation itself is supposed to decrease prices, which is deflationary, and that's phenomenal for everybody because if you can make something cheaper and compete with somebody else, then that's going to bring the price of that thing down. But we have these monopolies everywhere, propped up by government regulation, and it's all of these fires that I was talking about earlier that make these transitions for society much more difficult. The buggy whip manufacturers and the lamplighters that had to transition into a new job, yes, that was difficult for them. And it's sad that their investment in these industries that were useful for society at some time was now kind of made obsolete. And that's tragic. But to prevent, that happening, to prevent the transition into these technologies that made our lives so much better is obviously not the right course. And just straight up handing money to people, which will cause inflation and all these other things, is not the right course either. So I don't have a solution to your problem, but it's just kind of a perspective on why it is such an issue.
Well, and it's always easier to think about these things. You break them down to the lowest level, right? And I try to do this whenever I explain economics to the layperson. Disruption of industry through technological progress, through changes in productivity, they are a fundamental nature of markets. You can go all the way back to the invention of the first tool, right? I mean, let's say you had like a whole bunch of laborers tilling the ground in a field with rocks, and some guy comes up with the crazy idea to put the rock on the end of a stick and use it as a hoe. Well, now his productivity has increased, 100%. And you can just hear, the concern trolls coming to the front of the circle saying, well, how are, we're going to have to take half of these people that work to till the fields with the rocks with their hands. And now it's only going to require half the people to till the field with these new tools. Like, we can't allow this to happen. That is an essential nature of human markets. It frees up labor to focus on other problems, right? I mean, that is not a bad thing, but the markets don't owe you compensation for technological solutions that increase productivity. Unless you're the one that wrote that software program, unless you're the one that figured out tying the stick to the rock made you more productive to produce crops, right? I mean, you're not guaranteed a share of that increase in productivity. And then that kind of flies in the face a little bit of the first chart that we have on the website about the wages being tied to productivity. And then, there was a schism that happened in 1971 where those two things separated. But all that really represents is the way, that monetary shift, that shift in monetary policy disrupted what was up until that point a fairly closely correlated phenomenon.
Yeah, and I'd point out one more thing here on this whole big topic is that if you look at the last 100 years, we've had immense increases in living standards, and none of that has to do with them printing money. It has to do with technological progress itself. With deflation, it is much despite the inflation that these deflationary forces have caused it to be so much easier to, we always point to the simple example of the washing machine that saves us time in our day. And, as it gets cheaper to make washing machines and they become more ubiquitous, then our productivity as a society is increased. That has been the progress that we've seen over the past century. And it's much despite all of this, monetary intervention, and I find it so frustrating when you argue with a Keynesian apologist that says something along those lines that oh, but look, everything's working so great. We've seen all of these increases in living standards, and I point to it's exactly the opposite. It is the deflation that has allowed us to really prop up even the little man in our society. It's just an illusion.
Yeah, and I'm a strong believer in that too. And it just innately thinking about the monetary system alongside these strong deflationary pressures in the tech sector and industrial sector overall. Like, industrial building technology is getting better significantly over the last 5 decades as well. Like, it just makes sense that you would want a sound currency that is hyper deflationary in a way where you can have a better opportunity to save, and as prices are going down, the money that you are saving is going to be able to buy you more, right? Like, it just makes sense to me innately.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to the whole using money as the measuring stick for prices. And if I'm trying to argue that it is the progress of society to decrease prices, to compete with people, and to increase the productivity of your, I mean, that's what the market rewards, people that can make something cheaper or make it more valuable for the same price. That it is that concept that drives us forward. That is economic progress in itself. And when you have a sound money that measures that progress, then it reflects that in prices. But when you have a unsound money that can hide that, I often talk about how the Federal Reserve targets 2% inflation nominally, right? Nominally. So if society as a whole is decreasing prices at 2% per year, then theoretically they're just keeping everything flat. But if society decreases prices at 10% per year or 20% per year, well, then where is all of that 20% going if they're targeting the 2% nominal inflation? It takes a bit to wrap your head around here. But no matter how fast society progresses and decreases prices, on average, based on the CPI, they're going to eat it all up in inflation. And where's that money going to go? Well, I've argued that it's going to get dumped on the stock market and increase the wealth of the 0.1% stuff. So, yeah, mull that one over.
No, that, and then I guess to a point where it's like it's really a moral argument too. Like, let's talk about the externalities of going off the gold standard, what it's done for family formation, for life expectancy, for drug abuse. Money stress is a big stress. It's number one stress on anybody's mind. If you ask couples or individuals even what they're most worried about, it's like money. And when you fuck up the money, you're going to really increase the amount of overall stress that exists in a society.
Yeah, one of the charts on our website is divorce rates. And one of the big pushbacks that we've gotten on that, and this is something Ben and I kind of discovered independently, was that they changed no-fault divorce law in 1971. And up until that point, there was no-fault divorce clause in the United States. And a lot of people just, even if they wanted to get divorced, they couldn't. And I understand, of course, that's going to affect the statistics. Of course, like I said, the data is cherry-picked. It's a meme, right? I mean, if you actually think that WTF 1971 is like, it's legitimate. I'm not trying to say it's not legitimate, but it's intentionally memed to get more eyeballs on it, to get more people asking the question, what the fuck happened in 1971? But, you look at any survey of married couples, and like you said, Marty, the number one thing that causes conflict in those marriages is money. So of course, changing the money had an effect on divorce rates. Of course it did. It might not have been the only contributing factor, right? Networks, systems are very complicated, particularly when they involve humans. There's lots of variables at play. But to say that it was no-fault divorce law and that money wasn't a contributing factor is just asinine.
Yeah, and then the compounding effects of that, right? Like so the money stress drives both parents into the workforce, which means there's less time away from their kids to raise their children. And eventually, if the stresses get too much, they get divorced, and that creates a psychological problem for the children. And then just the ripple effects of this policy, like, I don't even think they can be calculated if you've even tried to.
Right, and it forces adults to dump their dying parents into nursing homes rather than bringing them home to spend the last years of their life changing their diapers. They would rather send them to a nursing home and let someone who gets paid minimum wage do it. And that's really a product of our, the demand for time, demand for yield. People don't want to give up working that extra shift to be able to be home taking care of mom and dad, with Alzheimer's or whatever. They have to, or at least they're feeling compelled to pawn that responsibility off to someone else. And they would rather work the extra shift to pay for the nursing home costs. And that's really like indicative of like breakdown in greater society. I mean, and it's really destructive. Like you said, like that doesn't bode well for the future, because it has all of these compounding effects on the way that our families interact with each other, on the way that we interact with our neighbors, on the way that we think about the future.
Shit, man. You just got me thinking. We were on a sound money standard. Maybe this coronavirus wouldn't be as bad as it is now because it's attacking the nursing homes. And maybe if people were more incentivized to have their parents living with them, you want to have a spread as vast as we've seen it up to this point.
Not to mention we'd have more savings. I mean, I have a chart on the website that just tracks savings over, after 1971. And then actually it goes up for just a moment after 1971 in 2008 when there was a massive deflationary event as well. But other than that, it's just been on a downward trend since because, it's very clear that inflationary money disincentivizes savings and incentivizes debt. And we have more debt than has ever really been a case before. And even as a nation, we have the CBO just predicted. I actually have a chart on here that the CBO predicted that debt would go higher than World War II. Well, that actually already happened. I think it's just happening now. This chart wasn't early enough. The CBO just predicted that we're about to surpass the debt held by the public as a percentage of GDP from World War II. We're already about to surpass that just in this crisis. So, it's devastating to society.
The other thing that we passed was Federal Reserve balance sheet as a percentage of GDP. We rocketed past all-time highs on that. It's like 30 or 35% now. It's unbelievably high.
So how do we get away from this? I mean, obviously we're all Bitcoiners here. We'd like to transition to a Bitcoin standard, but how do you guys think that happens practically, if at all?
As Colin was alluding to earlier, the longer that this gets delayed, the longer that the capitulation needs to happen, the liquidation of malinvestment needs to happen, the harder it gets. And I've thought a lot about what this transition to a Bitcoin standard would actually look like if it happened, and some think it'll happen gradually, and some think it'll happen suddenly, and some people say suddenly and then or gradually and then suddenly. But regardless, it still will be a painful transition. Ray Dalio talks about in his the system is broken letter that the people that position themselves for these paradigm shifts are the ones that stand to profit. And what he's really saying there is most people won't be prepared for these things. But what I'm trying to argue is that I think the longer this gets delayed and the more they, more money they print, actually the worse it is for society to transition back to a sound money, because it will cause massive deflation, and that will be very terrible for people who own debt, or for people who have debt. Sorry. And I just hope it happens more gradually, and I hope it happens earlier rather than later. That's my take on it.
I'll be very clear that I believe the greatest cause of our strife is the disruption of power between the individual and the state. And I believe that fixing the money is the only way to claw back enough of that power to make a difference. I think that until you can take away the seigniorage and the credit expansion rights of the state, and until you can hold them accountable for their own spending and for their own, we know as Austrians that democracies trend to socialism. That's just an inevitability, right? And the founding fathers of America understood that, and it's why Ben Franklin said, when he came out of the Continental Congress, when they said, "Mr. Franklin, what did you give us?" And he said, "A republic if you can keep it," right? He understood that it took a society full of well-informed individuals who respected liberty in order to maintain it, in a constitutional republic, or, even in a democracy particularly. And we don't have that anymore. I mean, the honest truth is that we don't have that anymore. And the only solution is to take back some of the power, the disruption of the power dynamic back away from the state. And if that isn't done, there won't be any fixing it. And that's what Bitcoin is intended to do. That's what it was designed to do. And if you believe anything else, you're fooling yourself.
I completely agree. It just got me all jacked up. And it's disheartening, especially now during these lockdowns, to see how little people do care about liberty and how quickly they are giving away their civil liberties in the face of fear, mainly the fear of the unknown created by this virus. And luckily, thank God we have Bitcoin. I can't imagine what life would be like right now if it weren't here and didn't have this easy exit option that exists. Because I can't think of any other tool that allows you to exit the system as directly as Bitcoin does that exists right now. Can you?
I would be very pessimistic about the future if it wasn't for Bitcoin. I was until I discovered Bitcoin. I don't see any other way, right? I mean, I love, recently we added the Hayek quote to the bottom of the WTF 1971 website about finding a sly roundabout way to take money back from the government, because Ben and I, we wanted to accomplish two things there. One, we love that quote. And two, we wanted to make a subtle, slight nod to Bitcoin, because WTF 1971 is not Ben and I's marketing model for Bitcoin. It's just a way to try to wake up people to economics. And we don't want to try to sell anyone anything with that process, because I feel like it dilutes the message, right? Because somebody who already doesn't have an understanding of economics isn't going to understand why Bitcoin's important. And if you tell them to buy it because you think it's going to go to 100K, within a year, then they're going to think you have an agenda. And you do, right? Everybody that's in Bitcoin is financially incentivized to get as many people into Bitcoin as possible, because that's just the way money works. And we've never seen the monetization of a new asset before like this. And of course it's unprecedented. Of course it looks ridiculous when you extrapolate out what you think the future looks like, but it's inevitable and it has to happen. And Bitcoin is the only way, right? I mean, we have to get to the point where Bitcoin is strong enough to resist attacks by the state, direct attacks that are funded by the expansion of money, by the expansion of credit to try to control the network. It has to get to that point. If it doesn't, then it will fail.
I think we're getting closer than most people expect. I think we're, 11 years in. It's been around for more than a decade. Like it'd be hard for me to imagine. It is hard for me to imagine that they're able to stomp this out. It's like part of the culture now. Everybody knows what Bitcoin is. They might not understand it, but they at least heard it and understand that it exists. I could be wrong though. Maybe all the people who know what it is think it's dumb and should be abolished.
No, I think it's all about incentives, and I think like the work that you guys are doing is incredibly important, right? Because you're providing an opportunity for yield in places that normally are desperate for it. Like you look at what's going on in the oil markets right now, and you look at this desperate need for solvency, this desperate search for alternative uses of resources to find yield. And Bitcoin is the solution for so many people in so many cases. Like all of this excess energy, all of this waste energy, all of this unharnessed energy, all across the board, energy is just a stranded resource. And if it can be harnessed for profit, you better believe that incentives of human nature will make that so. And that is so good for us.
Yeah, no, knock on wood. It seems to be happening. I think people are starting to have aha moments, and what we're doing in the oil fields, like it is, and that's why I'm confident it's going to happen. It's like undeniable, like how like the opportunity cost of selling that gas down a pipeline or turning it into an NGL, it doesn't, it's too much compared to just putting some miners on site and turning it into Bitcoin. It's so much more profitable.
I think it's really hard for a lot of people to understand Bitcoin because, as Colin just alluded to, this is literally unprecedented in human history. Nothing like it has ever happened. And I don't mean, a distributed ledger of computers reaching consensus. I mean a real-time monetization of an asset. We've seen, things be demonetized in real time before. You can go back to the glass beads and the Yepes stones from societies that stored their money in not a hard money or money that had other poor characteristics. But we've never seen something emerge just and be thrust upon the world that had the potential to be such a huge improvement upon money. And because that's never happened, there's absolutely no framework, there's no economic model, there is no way to compare this to anything before it. And I think people have such a hard time wrapping their head around something that has never happened before, and therefore we don't have a way to incorporate that into our viewpoint. We have to develop from scratch, and I think it's such an amazing thing to be a part of the people that are actually trying to interpret that and actually try to understand this event that the Bitcoiners believe is already underway. And it's so marred an illusion because people in the finance space that you think would be like all over this, their entire life is made around trying to profit from the movement of these different assets in US dollars. And it's so hard for them to get away from that. I can't wait for Bitcoin to go to 200K because then I can sell some and get more US dollars, because that's the end game, right? The end game has never been to hold on to government bonds and just forever, and that's what you're going to have, government bonds or stocks, and it's just that's the money now. Bitcoin is the new money. And I don't know, maybe I'm not articulating it well, but I think that's just so fascinating.
Well, something Ben and I have talked about too, it's almost impossible to make baby boomers understand this narrative, and it's to a certain degree probably also Gen X. And the reason is because it takes a very asymmetrical thinker who's benefited from inflation their entire life to take a step back and say this might not be good. You see like Ray Dalio like kind of on the edge of that, right? Seeing it and looking at the system that he's profited from his entire professional career, and once he gets out of it, he's able to take a step back and say, well, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. But you take the average baby boomer, and their solution, to having nothing is to, well, why don't you just start acquiring assets, right? And of course, that's easy to say. It's easy to say when you at least thought you had a completely paid for retirement ahead of you, to point the finger at millennials and Gen Z and say, well, you're just lazy. I worked for everything I had. I accumulated assets. They increased in value. I bought my house for $2,500 or whatever, and now it's worth, $500,000. And I worked hard for this my entire life. And of course they did. I don't want to take away, the fruits of their labor. But how do you show somebody that has been the recipient of asset inflation their entire life that they've priced entire generations out of entering the system, and they are now stuck at the bottom, right? And the social unrest that causes. And of course, it seems like UBI is inevitable, right? I mean, you have the average 20-year-old today starting their life out with like 6 figures in debt. How are they ever going to start a family? How are they ever going to, God forbid, they'll never be able to start a business. I mean, come on.
And they still live with their parents too.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, no, how do you ever get, that's what I was going to bring up, is the second to last chart on the page is, to your question, like, how do you ever get a boomer or a Gen Xer to rethink this? And I think them noticing their kids are living with them and they weren't, into their early 30s. So the chart ends in middle of 2015. And so it's probably increased since this point, but the share of 25 to 29-year-olds living with their parents or grandparents is above 30%. So it's a third of the demographic, which is pretty insane.
And I don't think that there's anybody, I don't think there are a whole lot of like late 20s, early 30-year-olds that want to live at home with their parents. I mean, maybe there are some. I mean, in a lot of sense, I think that people, you spend your whole, this is something I heard someone say the other day, a guy named Bill Cooper. I was listening to some of his older work. You spend your whole young life trying to get away from your parents, trying to go and become, self-sufficient. And then once we become adults, many people spend their whole entire life trying to find someone to be their parents again. And in the most cases, that's the state, right? People want to go back to that point in childhood where they didn't have to worry about anything, where everything was taken care of for them, and they had no freedom, but they also had no responsibility.
Right. And that drives like another point home. With all this money printing and now welfare, like, what does it mean for society overall when you have a bunch of individuals who just aren't motivated or driven to make their lives better? Like, can we get out of this vicious cycle? There are too many people too far gone and dependent on the state that they, like you just described, they're looking for that paternal, maternal arbiter of their life to come in and basically provide comfort for them. Is the pussification of the world gone too far?
Misaligned incentives corrupts our culture, and misaligned money does the same thing. So again, I always try to remain optimistic ever since I found Bitcoin, that a sound money will tend to breed a sounder society. So never give up, man. I mean, yeah, things could look bad, but I certainly hope that, as Brady always says, the dawn of the Bitcoin Renaissance, the Renaissance itself will be a renaissance of everything, culture and economics and everything.
No, I agree. I'm an eternal optimist as well. Just got to play devil's advocate there.
I like it. Push back.
And
and
it's hard to deny.
There's a Hay quote. I don't remember like the exact wordage, but it goes something along the lines of, strength of character and strength of will, or something like that, are nearly impossible to find in a society where men are not confident that they can make their way by their own efforts. I believe it was Hayek.
Powerful. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Like, why even strive to be greater if you don't think you can do it yourself? If you're looking at history of the last 5 decades, most people not being able to save enough money to even retire, or retire in comfort, like, why even work hard? Why do that? Like, is it even worth it? And I guess the question is, and what we've been getting at here this whole episode is, all right, it could be better. You got to fix the money first. Fix the money, fix the world is something I've been trying to meme more often, because I think it is, as we've said, the most important thing to fix. Like, as Colin, his very invigorating speech, I'll say it's a speech, earlier in the podcast, like, if we want to fix this, we need to take control of the money, which gives us leverage against the state, which is enacting all these policies that really put society in a bad spot.
Easy times breed, what is it? Weak men, and hard times breed strong men, or something like that. What's that? You've put that on the pod before.
Yeah, easy times breed weak men breed hard times breed strong
There you
men.
go.
Strong men build good times. Cycle there. So it seems like we're
sorry, I keep interrupting you. One of the things that's really important about Bitcoin, aside from the fact that, yeah, we're trying to fix the money, is the fact that it's encouraging for people, right? People like us who we're asymmetric thinkers. We're okay with going against the grain. We like to ask why, right? We want to solve problems. It's important to give people like that something to rally around a little bit, right? Like, if you're demoralized all the time, well, then, yeah, maybe it would just be better if we let the state take care of us. You know, if you can't break out of that, like, what chance do you have?
Yeah, and again, like, thank God we have Bitcoin. And that's another beauty of Bitcoin too, is that you just meet these like-minded individuals who are asymmetric thinkers and not afraid to go against the grain, that are just congregating more and more around this protocol, this network that we're trying to build out and meme into existence. I mean, it already is in existence, but meme into the mainstream. And that's what encourages me the most. And I said this on a couple of podcasts this week with developers who are building out the protocol, like, just seeing the interest around protocol development specifically, and more people coming to Bitcoin to help build this out is highly encouraging.
Absolutely.
Gentlemen, I wish we had another hour and a half to rip here. Unfortunately, I have to go. Is there any parting notes or thoughts that you guys want to end on before we wrap up here?
Yeah, if anyone knows what the fuck happened in 1971, please let us know.
Yeah, we keep asking everybody.
I just get a lot of bad answers. Like, someone said it was Disney World. I'm not so sure.
Hey, could have been Disney World. Who knows? Might have been Nixon. Might have been the opening up of the ability to divorce. Who knows? Who knows? There's a lot of weird things going on at the same time. Gentlemen, I really appreciate your time. We should definitely do this again and expand on some of these topics. Dive into the nitty-gritty of every way in which the inflationary monetary policy that persists throughout the world sort of erodes the quality of life on this planet.
Thank you so much for having us on, Marty. Long time coming, brother.
I know. I can't wait till we can all congregate back in New York and get another burger at JG.
That'd be amazing.
I severely miss that place.
Thank you to the freaks. Shout out to the freaks. You guys are the best.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah. All right. Keep crushing it, guys. Really appreciate the work you're doing. Peace and love, freaks.